I came upon it in the 50s when I was going to school in Colorado. I grew up in California and I was traveling back and forth, and I used to like to explore. I still do. But I just found this canyon by exploration, and I was looking for shortcuts, just different routes going back and forth to.
Robert Redford was the golden icon of American cinema, a legend whose talent, charm, and mystery captivated generations. But for all his fame, Redford remained fiercely private, especially when it came to his personal life. Behind the iconic smile and piercing eyes was a man who suffered quietly, through family tragedy, emotional isolation, and the crushing cost of fame. And standing beside him for much of his later life was Sibila Sagars, the woman who loved him in the shadows, respected his silence, and protected his pain. But now, in the quiet after his death, she is finally breaking her own. Until now, Sibyl had remained a figure of quiet dignity. Rarely granting interviews, rarely revealing anything about the man millions adored, she was his anchor, the one person who understood the weight he carried behind the scenes. But grief has a way of cracking the walls that silence built. And today, for the first time, she's pulling back the curtain on the real Robert Redford, the private struggles, the unbearable losses, the regrets he carried to his final days. This isn't a scandalous exposé. It's something deeper. It's a final love letter, a haunting, heart-breaking look into the man the world thought they knew, through the eyes of the woman who knew him best. And once you hear what she has to say, you'll never look at Robert Redford the same way again. To the public, Robert Redford was the embodiment of American grace, a golden-haired rebel whose presence lit up the screen with effortless charm and quiet strength. From Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to The Way We Were, he wasn't just a movie star, he was an institution. But to Sibyl Sagars, he was something else entirely. He was a man of deep thought, quiet sorrow, and complicated solitude. When she met him in the early 1990s, Redford was already a living legend. Yet what drew her in wasn't the fame. It was the walls he had built around himself, and the loneliness that seeped through their cracks. For decades, Redford carried the burden of private grief behind his signature smile. Long before he met Sibyl, his life had been marked by unspeakable tragedy. In 1959, he and his then-wife Lola lost their infant son, Scott, to sudden infant death syndrome. Redford was just beginning his career, and the loss nearly shattered him. Few knew how much it haunted him. He spoke of it rarely, but the pain never left. It was like a wound that never healed, Sibyl once quietly told a friend. She said Redford didn't like to talk about death, even when it lingered in the corners of every conversation. He'd turn inward, retreating to painting, to his cabin in Sundance, to the silence of the wilderness. That's where she found him. That's where their story began. Unlike Redford's previous public relationships, his bond with Sibyl remained almost entirely private. A German-born artist herself, she understood his need for solitude. She didn't try to pull him into the spotlight. She protected him from it. He had given enough of himself to the world, she once whispered, but the world always wanted more. They shared a quiet existence, split between New Mexico and Utah, far from Hollywood's flashing cameras. And though he rarely appeared on red carpets with her, those closest to him said she brought a peace into his life that he had never known before. But loving Redford wasn't easy. He carried wounds no one could see. The suicide of his son James in 2020, after years of liver disease and cancer, broke something in him. Again. He withdrew even further from the public eye, retreating into himself in a way that worried even his closest friends. Sibyl later said that after James passed, Robert became more reflective than ever. He talked about legacy, about what he'd done wrong, what he wished he had said to his children, she said. He never forgave himself for being absent when they needed him most. In those final years, he was less the movie star and more the man grieving, aching and holding close the few he still trusted. Now, after his death, Sibyl has begun to speak, not for publicity, not for attention, but because she believes the truth of who he really was deserves to be known. Not the flawless icon, not the golden boy of cinema, but the deeply human soul who lived in quiet torment, who fought lifelong battles with grief, who carried the weight of fatherhood and fame like twin anchors. She says the world saw his strength, but few ever saw his fragility. And now for the first time she wants to share that fragility, not to diminish him, but to honor the depth of the man she loved. Their love story wasn't one of tabloid headlines or red carpet declarations. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, far from the prying eyes of the public. When Sybil Zaggers met Robert Redford in the early 1990s, she was an artist who found meaning in abstraction and silence. And he was a man still hiding from the pain of his past. There were no grand gestures or Hollywood declarations. Instead, there was a mutual understanding, a gentleness, a recognition of something broken, and the willingness to hold it without trying to fix it. As Sybil would later say, "We met in the quiet, and that's where we stayed." Redford had spent a lifetime avoiding the spotlight off-screen. Despite being one of the most recognizable faces in cinema, he rarely gave interviews about his personal life. His marriage to his first wife, Lola Van Wagenen, ended in 1985 after 27 years, a union marked by the weight of fame and private heartbreak. After that, he became even more guarded. Love was something he kept close, quiet, and fiercely protected. When Sybil entered his life, it wasn't about passion in the explosive Hollywood sense. It was about healing. She wasn't drawn to the legend. She was drawn to the man behind it. And that's exactly what he needed. For years, their relationship remained largely out of the public eye. They attended a few quiet events together, mostly art-related, and rarely gave the press anything to speculate on. In 2009, after nearly 2 decades together, they quietly married in Hamburg, Germany. No fanfare. No cameras. Just a small circle of friends and family. It was as if Redford had spent his entire life searching for a piece he didn't believe existed. And in Sybil, he finally found it. She didn't need the spotlight. She gave him space to breathe. And most importantly, she listened when he spoke, which wasn't often, and never about the things that pained him most. But when he did open up, she held his words like fragile glass. If you're finding this story as moving as we are, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment your thoughts below. It helps us share more powerful, untold stories like this one, and keeps the memory of legends like Robert Redford alive. As Redford aged, his world shrank by design. He pulled back from acting, shifted his focus to environmental causes and the Sundance Institute, but even those grew quieter in his final years. Sybil became not only his wife but his closest confidant. Friends say she was the only person who could reach him in those final seasons of life. When the weight of James's death in 2020 pushed Redford into near total silence, Sybil was the one who remained by his side, walking with him through the grief, even as it threatened to consume them both. She later admitted that after James passed, Robert was never the same. He'd always carried grief from the loss of baby Scott, but James's death, his adult son, a filmmaker in his own right, reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Sybil says those final years were some of their most intimate, not because of joyful moments, but because of the quiet resilience it took to face each day. "We didn't talk much," she said. "We didn't need to. Just being together, that was enough." That was everything. It was a different kind of love. One forged not in noise or spectacle, but in silence. A love that respected pain, made room for it, and refused to abandon it. And in that silence, Sybil became not just a partner, but the keeper of a story the world had never heard, until now. In the final years of Robert Redford's life, grief became a constant companion, not something to be overcome, but something to be carried. For a man known for his composed, almost stoic presence, Redford had endured more loss than most could bear. And while the world continued to celebrate his career, his legacy, and his status as one of Hollywood's last true icons, the man behind the fame was slowly fading under the weight of unspoken sorrow. According to Sybil Zaggers, even as he smiled for rare appearances or stood proudly beside his environmental work, he was never far from the past. "He lived with ghosts," she said softly. "Every day." The loss of his infant son Scott in 1959 was the first crack in his emotional armor. Redford rarely spoke about it publicly, but Sybil later revealed that it haunted him in ways no one understood. "He would stare out the window sometimes," she said, "and I could tell. He wasn't seeing the trees or the mountains. He was back there, in that hospital room. But what truly devastated Redford was the death of his second son, James, in 2020. James wasn't just his child. He was his friend, his creative partner, his mirror. James had battled liver disease for most of his life, even undergoing a transplant at just 29. Despite his health struggles, James built a career as a filmmaker and activist, someone who, like his father, believed in storytelling as a force for change. When James died at just 58, it wasn't unexpected, but it was unbearable. Redford didn't issue a public statement. He didn't appear at the memorial. He simply withdrew. Those close to the family said it was as if something broke inside him. Sibylle, ever the quiet guardian of his soul, said that James's death left Redford drifting. He would wake up and forget for a moment that James was gone. And then I'd see it hit him all over again. There was no more pretending. No more hiding behind work or public appearances. Robert Redford, the legend, was grieving like any father, broken, confused, and deeply alone. It wasn't just the loss of his children that wore him down. Redford had outlived many of his peers, many of the friends he had worked with for decades. Paul Newman, Sidney Pollack, Barbara Streisand, though alive, had long retreated from public life. He used to say he didn't recognize the world anymore, Sibylle recalled. He felt like he had outlasted everyone, and he wasn't sure why. That kind of emotional isolation is impossible to describe, a loneliness that isn't about being alone, but about feeling left behind by time itself. Even in their private sanctuary, their home nestled in the high desert of New Mexico, Redford became quieter. He stopped painting. He stopped writing. He'd walk in the garden sometimes for hours saying nothing. Sibylle said those walks frightened her. I wasn't sure if he was searching for peace or just waiting for it. Still, she never left his side. She made tea. She read aloud from books they loved. She played piano in the evenings, hoping the music would reach something inside him. Some days it did. Most days, it didn't. What made his grief so difficult was that Redford never truly believed he had the right to express it. He thought pain was private, Sibylle said. He believed he had to be strong, not just for himself, but for the world that expected him to be unshakable. That belief, that strength meant silence, became a cage in his final days. A cage Sibylle could not break, but she stayed. Because sometimes love means not fixing the pain, but sitting beside it, holding its hand, bearing witness, and in doing so, she became the only one who truly saw him, not as a legend, but as a grieving father, a tired man, and a soul nearing the end of its long journey. After Robert Redford passed, the world mourned a legend. Tributes poured in from fellow actors, directors, and fans across the globe. They celebrated his films, his activism, his iconic presence that had shaped American cinema for over half a century. But while the public honored the myth, one woman mourned the man. Sibylle Sagars, the woman who had stood quietly beside him for over 30 years, didn't rush to the cameras or issue bold statements. She did what she had always done. She waited until the noise faded. And then softly, she began to speak. In a rare and emotional conversation with close friends, Sibylle offered a glimpse into the man behind the mask, not to rewrite history, but to humanize it. He didn't want the world to know how sad he was, she said. He wanted to be remembered as strong. But strength isn't the absence of sadness. It's the ability to keep going in spite of it. Her voice trembled when she spoke of his final days. He didn't say goodbye, she revealed. He just held my hand, and that was enough. There were no dramatic last words. No grand declarations, just silence. The same silence that had defined their love from the beginning. She shared that Robert was never interested in being remembered as a celebrity. He wanted his legacy to be about impact, about truth. He loved the land. He loved art. He loved stories that mattered. In their final years together, he asked her to continue that legacy, not through fame, but through purpose. She now runs the Redford Center and continues to advocate for environmental awareness and indigenous rights, two causes dear to his heart. He gave everything to the world, she said, and now I will give what's left of him back to the earth he loved. The tragedy of Robert Redford is not in how he died. It's in how much of his soul the world never truly saw. He lived his life like his performances, controlled, elegant, emotionally restrained. But beneath that composure was a man who had loved deeply, suffered immensely, and wrestled with questions no spotlight could answer. And perhaps that's why his story resonates so deeply now, because it reminds us that even the brightest stars carry shadows. Sibyl's words, quiet, poetic and unflinchingly honest, serve not only as a eulogy, but as a final act of devotion. In breaking her silence, she did not betray his privacy. She honored it. By revealing his grief, she made space for her own. And in speaking of his regrets, she gave us all permission to forgive our own. "He wasn't perfect," she said, tears streaming. But he was real, and that's what made him beautiful. Robert Redford will always be remembered, not just for the roles he played, but for the life he lived behind the scenes. A life of love, loss, struggle, and grace. His death left a silence in Hollywood, but it also opened a space for a deeper truth, one that Sibyl is now gently filling with her voice. And in that voice we hear not just sorrow, but something sacred, the kind of love that doesn't fade when the spotlight goes out, but burns quietly, forever.